Freedom. Something that we celebrated last Sunday with Juneteenth as we acknowledge the freeing of the last slaves in Galveston, Texas in 1865, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Freedom is something we'll get to celebrate again, not next Sunday, but the day after that on July 4th, as we celebrate the freedom that we have from the oppression that England had over us. Freedom is something we treasure here in the U.S. with our rights and our freedoms. As the Declaration of Independence states, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Freedom. Rights. It seems to me as we've moved throughout history here in the U.S., much of the focus of freedom and rights tends to be on the individual. What are my freedoms? What are my rights? And what is freedom? Does freedom mean I can do anything that I want to do? Am I truly free if my cravings and desires are driving me in whatever direction they decide? And where does my freedom end and yours begin? Tough questions in our day and age as we sift through what it means to be free, as we live in this land of the free and home of the brave. One of the phrases that has come to characterize our age today is, "You do you." You do you. It's a phrase that has some health and some unhealth, like most things on this side of heaven. The positive side of this "you do you" ideology is that, well, you don't have to conform to somebody's expectations. You don't have to be somebody you're not. You can celebrate the uniqueness that God has given you. You can celebrate the uniqueness of who you are, the talents you have, the interests that you have. The challenge with this is sorting out what of that uniqueness is coming to us from God who creates us into this image, and what of that is Satan getting in and twisting things around and distorting the goodness that God has created. The challenging part with "you do you" is it really focuses everything on me and on you. Reminded me of a Toby Keith song from about 20 years ago, "I Want to Talk About Me." Yeah, he's saying, I want to talk about me, I want to talk about I want to talk about number one, oh my, me, my, what I think, what I like, what I know, what I want, what I see. Right? All about me. And that's the challenge of our age. And the challenge of indulging the freedoms that we have, that sometimes we become a slave to the unholy trinity of me, myself, and I. And yet God calls us to something else. As he speaks through the Apostle Paul in Galatians 5:1, he says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." As Paul speaks to us here, he says, don't just do something, stand there. I know the phrase is don't just stand there, do something, but if you look at Paul's words here, he's saying, don't just do something, stand there, stand firm in the freedom that you have. Stand firm in the freedom that Jesus has won for you. As Paul writes to this church in Galatia. Galatia is an interesting region. It is what is now central Turkey, and it was settled by the Celts in about 300 BC. Eventually became part of the Roman Empire. And the congregation here is one that Paul planted himself. He got these people started in their way of following Jesus. And he knew that they were ambitious, that they wanted to be the best Jesus followers that they could be. As Paul writes to them now, well, there's been some other teachers that have come in after him. And these teachers are saying things like, well, if you really want to follow Jesus, you need to be circumcised. If you really want to follow Jesus, you need to celebrate all the Hebrew festivals. If you really want to follow Jesus, you need to only eat kosher foods. And they brought in this legalism that Paul is pushing back against. He's reminding them of their freedom. And yet, we kind of have two extremes in this. On the one hand, we have legalism. Rules, 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 and even more rules, right? And then on the other hand, we have what theologians call antinomianism, which is a fancy word for anarchy. Anything goes, whatever, can be complete chaos. If we look at our own culture here in the U.S., on the one hand, we can look back to the Victorian era, an era where there were lots of rules. Men had to dress a certain way, women had to dress a certain way. There were, different ways that were appropriate for doing life and living life, and everything needed to fall within these expectations. And then we swing over to the 1960s. Anything goes, right? The free love movement, and a lot of craziness in the U.S. Paul is trying to steer between these two poles. And as he does this, he acknowledges that we have a civil war going on inside of us. We have a civil war between the flesh and the spirit. We have a civil war between the things that God desires from us and the things that our sinful, broken, fallen nature craves in spite of it. So as Paul writes in verse 17 of chapter 5 in Galatians, he says, "For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." You're not to do whatever you want. Because that fleshly nature sometimes traps us into thinking that what we're doing is exercising our freedom, and all it is enslaving us with our sinful cravings and desires. That selfishness that continues to corrupt us. As Paul continues in verses 19 to 21, he says, "The acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like." And he's saying this is not an all-inclusive list. This is just a broad sampling of the stuff that leads us away from Jesus. And if we drill down into each one of these, they're ultimately all about me. Sexual immorality. I can have sex with whoever I want, whenever I want. Impurity, debauchery, idolatry. I can worship whatever I want. Hatred. If you disagree with me, I can hate you. Discord. I can raise up division if I'm not getting my way. Jealousy. Well, you can't have what I don't have. Fits of rage. When things don't go my way, I'm going to lay on the floor and scream and holler and pound my fists. That inner 2-year-old comes out, doesn't it? But it's all about me. Every one of these things in this list is a self-centered, self-focused desire. So how are we to live? As Paul writes in verse 13, he says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love." Don't be trapped by those self-focused, self-centered desires that can lead to your destruction. Live a life of service, freely serving one another. As Martin Luther wrote, he said, "A Christian is a free lord over all things and subject to no one. A Christian is a subservient slave of all things and subject to everyone." It's an interesting dichotomy in which we live. Free, and yet free to serve. There's a tension in this freedom, in that, with the reality that freedom does come with a price. At times I serve when it's not convenient for me. But I serve because Christ's love compels me to. And it's ultimately that love of Christ that put him on a cross to pay the ultimate price for our freedom from sin. As Paul writes in Galatians 2, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." And it's that love of Jesus that caused him to live the life that we only can dream of living, a life that was perfect, a life that was sinful, a life that was mistake-free, a life that was without regret. And then to allow himself to be nailed to a cross, dying for the sins of the world before coming back again, and calling us to follow him. That's why Paul writes in verse 20, "Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit." That phrase, "keep in step," is a military term. It's a term that is used for marching, so that everybody is in step with everyone else. And so Paul is urging us to, as we live by the Spirit, to step with the Spirit. To step forward in faith with the Spirit. And as we experience that freedom, there are also costs. We pass things by that we might think would be enjoyable, but in fact are destructive. And we instead focus on those things that are good and right and excellent and worthy that God lays out ahead of us. As Paul writes in Galatians 5:22 and 23, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." And there is no one who would say any of those things are bad things. It's also interesting that Paul calls them the fruit, singular, of the Spirit. He doesn't say these are fruits of the Spirit. This is not a menu that we can say, well, I think I can handle this one and that one. I can, maybe handle some love, joy, and maybe a little peace, but that forbearance, that patience thing, that's a little bit much, right? No, these are all together. These are inseparable from one another. All of this fruit of the Spirit is like a fruit salad, where it's all together with its goodness. And this is what we get to live into as God's people. This is what we get to live into as we keep in step with the Spirit and enjoy the freedom that God has given us. Because Jesus says that if he has set us free, we are free indeed. We are free indeed. Freed from sin and free to serve. C.S. Lewis once wrote about a father whose child came to him and the child said, "Dad, can I have $5 to buy you a present?" And the dad willingly gave the child $5, and the child went and spent the money and brought Dad the gift and gave him the gift, and everybody was happy. And that's a lot like the good works that we do as we keep in step with the Spirit. The good things we do are not something we can do in and of our own self. We are only able to do them because of God's Spirit inside of us. That Spirit that has come to us at baptism and claimed and cleansed us, who has brought us to faith in Jesus. So you do you. And as you do you, remember that you are baptized. You have been bought with a price. The Almighty God who has created you has sent his Son to save you and continues to lead and guide you by his Spirit. Remember your baptism and draw on the nourishment that God gives us as he speaks to us in his word, as he comes and gives us his forgiveness here at his table. And as the Apostle Peter wrote, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. How will you live out your freedom this week?